So the AND sign allows you to invoke an expression or call an expression, evaluate an expression, whatever, on the parent scope of, whatever the directive is going to be inside of. So if we have our directive in here, we'll just create something called a phone, and we want to call something in the controller scope, we would use the AND sign. And so basically, so say we have a function here called call home, and we'll say called home. From our directive, we would just we'll create that phone, return an object with a scope, because we're isolating the scope from the parent scope, and I think we called it dial with an and sign. And then in our template, what we're going to do is create a button that we can click to call home. So div button, and then call home, and then we'll say ng click dial, because that's what this is, how this is kind of mapping to each other. You say dial here, which is going to invoke whatever you pass into dial, and then we'll say dial equals, and we called it call home. So dial equals call home. So from there, let's see, I missed something somewhere. App control phone app. Oh, that's an attribute, not an element. So that's what I do when I write the HTML before I write the JavaScript. Invalid isolate scope definition for directive phone. Oh, yeah, see? That's what you get for letting me do these live instead of polishing them up afterwards. All right, so we're set here. I put the template inside of the scope on accident. Just out of stupidity. So call home is going to invoke the controller scope of calling home. So what that means is you can do things like have an input in here, kind of input which has some sort of model, and we'll just say value, and then you can send something to that scope by passing in that value, and we're going to call this we'll just say message and value, and you need to use a special syntax where you pass an object into there so that it can get invoked. The expression can get evaluated that way. So this value is going to go along as the payload. It's going to expect a message. So in here, this needs to have a message now, and then in here, this will need to have a message as well, and then we can show the message itself. So now if I type something in here, click call home, you can see you can send the message from the phone to the controller and have basically no relationship between the two. This call home is basically just a kind of an API to the controller, or things it can access or know about for the directive to communicate outside of itself, even if these scopes are isolated. Because again, if you were to do multiple phone directives and the scopes aren't isolated, some of the bindings would mess up. So I can type in there, and then in here and here too, and have the bindings working inside of the directive, but they don't impact any of the bindings or update inside of the controller, because that doesn't happen until you invoke that that expression that you're passing along using the and sign. So again, just to kind of review here, we set up a method that we want to call on the scope here called call home. We set up the relationship by passing it into an attribute called dial, passing in a message. That dial is defined here with an and sign. And that means that if we invoke dial, then pass along an object with a message as the name, and then value as the value, then we can pass in whatever value and communicate with the controller from the directive. So it's much different from the equal sign or the at sign. And I'll do a review of all three to compare them. But this one is basically communicating back and forth without doing any sort of explicit binding like the equal sign does. So that's the and sign.